Hello, everybody. I'm Nick, and welcome to Conserving Catholicism. Can God make a stone too heavy for him to lift? Most theists believe that God is omnipotent, that he can do all things. But the paradox of the stone attempts to undermine this belief by demonstrating that the idea of an omnipotent being is incoherent. How so? If God can make a stone that he cannot lift, then he is not omnipotent because he cannot lift the stone. On the other hand, if God cannot make a stone that he cannot lift, then he is still not omnipotent because he cannot make the stone. Therefore, whether God can make such a stone or not, he could not be omnipotent. What can the theist say in response? The first position we will examine is presented by George Mavrotis in his essay, Some Puzzles Concerning Omnipotence. Mavrotis argues, from a Thomistic perspective, that God cannot make the stone, but his inability to do so indicates no lack of power on his part. Why? To borrow an example from Mavrotis, suppose you are the most talented geometrical artist, and you can draw every geometrical shape. If you were to draw a circle which was not perfectly circular, but instead had some rigid lines, we might say your skill as a geometrical artist is lacking. But suppose I ask you to draw me a square circle. You would be unable to draw a square circle for me, but this would not indicate any lack of skill on your part. It doesn't indicate any lack of skill on your part because drawing a square circle is logically impossible. Therefore, we can now see that omnipotence does not entail the ability to do all things absolutely. Omnipotence only entails being able to do all logically possible things, not all logically impossible things. How does this relate to the paradox? Mavrotis argues that the question attempts to show that God cannot be omnipotent because assuming so would lead to an absurdity. But Mavrotis argues that this is not the case because assuming God's omnipotence makes the question self-contradictory. Even the phrase, a stone too heavy for an all-powerful being to lift, is a contradictory phrase, just like a square circle or a married bachelor. Therefore, God's inability to make a stone too heavy for him to lift, just like the case with our perfect geometrical artist's inability to draw a square circle, proves no lack of power on God's part. The second position we will now look at is articulated by Wade Savage in his essay, The Paradox of the Stone. Savage argues that Mavrotis' response to the paradox is insufficient. This is because Mavrotis treats the paradox as if it were a reductio ad absurdum argument, which assumes the omnipotence of God. However, according to Savage, this is not what the paradox is doing. The paradox is attempting to demonstrate that an omnipotent being is self-contradictory. So Mavrotis' assumption of an omnipotent being as not being self-contradictory only begs the question. Savage argues that the paradox of the stone is really an attempted dilemma, but one which he thinks ultimately fails. Savage formulates the dilemma in this way. Either X can make a stone that X cannot lift, or X cannot make a stone that X cannot lift. In this dilemma, we are not implying that we are talking about God, and we are therefore not assuming that X is omnipotent. Therefore, if both horns of the dilemma result in the conclusion that X possesses an inability to do something, X is thereby limited and not omnipotent. Savage says that this is true of the first horn of the dilemma. X can make a stone that X cannot lift. If this horn of the dilemma is true, X is unable to do at least one thing, that is, X cannot lift the stone. Savage argues, however, that the second horn of the dilemma, X cannot make a stone that X cannot lift, does not logically imply that there is a task which X cannot perform. Savage claims that this only appears to us to be an inability of X because the phrase X cannot make a stone is misleading. We can clear up this confusion once we realize that saying if X can create a stone, X can lift it is the same thing as saying X cannot make a stone that X cannot lift. Savage offers us an example to better clarify this point for us. Suppose that I cannot lift a stone heavier than 70 pounds, and you cannot make a stone heavier than 70 pounds. If you cannot make a stone that I cannot lift, then you are limited in what you can do because you cannot make a stone heavier than 70 pounds. We can then properly say in this example that you cannot make a stone that I cannot lift. But suppose I can lift stones of any weight. This would mean that your inability to make a stone that I cannot lift does not necessarily mean you are limited. After all, you may be able to make stones of any weight, while I can lift stones of any weight. Yet, even then, it would still be proper for us to say, like it was in the other example, that you cannot make a stone that I cannot lift. However, unlike the previous example, this does not mean you are limited in any way in any of the stones that you can make. This is because you are able to make stones of any weight. Now, when we turn to God, Savage argues that God's inability to make a stone that he cannot lift is only a limitation on God's power if A, God is unable to create stones of any weight, or B, God is unable to lift stones of any weight. In other words, God is only limited in his power if he is limited in his power of stone creating or stone lifting. Therefore, if we substitute God for X in the second horn of the dilemma, so as to say God cannot make a stone that God cannot lift, we now see that this does not necessarily imply any contradiction. This is because, as Savage says, the statement, God can create stones of any poundage and can lift stones of any poundage, entails that God cannot create a stone which he cannot lift. Thus, saying God cannot create a stone which he cannot lift could only be shown to be contradictory if, as we've said, God's stone making or stone lifting powers are limited. But since this cannot be demonstrated, we can suppose neither of these limitations upon God's omnipotence exists. The last position we will look at is from Harry Frankfurt's essay titled The Logic of Omnipotence. In following Descartes, Frankfurt offers another response to the dilemma. Frankfurt attempts to show why the paradox of the stone is no real paradox, even if you reject Mavrody's and Aquinas' belief that God cannot do the logically impossible. After all, Descartes held that restricting God to be able to do only logically possible things is a real limitation on his omnipotence. Frankfurt assumes, like Mavrody's and unlike Savage, that the task of God making a stone that he cannot lift is logically impossible and self-contradictory. But, says Frankfurt, suppose God can do the logically impossible and make a stone that he cannot lift. If this is the case, and God is not bound by the laws of logic, then there is no reason to suppose that God cannot perform another logically impossible task, namely that God can lift a stone that he cannot lift. After all, Frankfurt argues, is there any greater trick in performing two logically impossible tasks than there is in performing one? Those are some of the solutions to the paradox of the stone. Thank you for tuning in to Conserving Catholicism, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless.